Today I'm going to be talking about the three basic forms of clay and the basic principles that you're going to need to know to essentially make any clay piece. When you get clay, they come in typically 25-pound blocks or tubes. And the way that it's made is that they put it in this device called a pug mill. The pug mill is essentially a big drill in a box. So they put the clay dust in there and they add water and the drill mixes it all up, and then it is forced out a tube or a square funnel. And so when it's mixed, it does come to you mixed, but it's not to the point where it is ideally usable. So whenever you get clay, the first thing that you need to do is wedge. And in baking terms, they typically call this kneading. So what you are going to do is you are going to use the butterfly position for your hands. The butterfly position is typically used across many of the different clay usages or techniques. The reason being is this is the strong part of your hand. That part of your hand lines up perfectly with your forearm, giving you a lot more strength than, say, your fingers. So by putting both hands together, thumbs together, you're broadening that area of force. So when you go to wedge, you're going to take your clay, you're going to do the butterfly hand, and you're going to push down and out. And you should get this heart shape in your clay. And then after, you're going to get this heart shape in your clay. Then you're going to take your fingers, wrap it around the edges, lean it back, and then you're going to continue doing that again and again. So I'm taking it and I'm turning it and I'm doing the same thing. And you want to do this about 30 times. As you get used to clay, you'll start recognizing how the clay should feel. Clay is more feel than it is sight. You need to feel how the clay is, the thickness of the clay, things like that, to understand what consistency the clay needs to be in, or how thick it needs to be, or to understand the properties of the clay. You'll start to notice that when you do this, it starts to roll on the side, and that's going to force out any air bubbles. It's going to mix any chunks of clay or any wet spots. And some people say it kind of looks like an elephant. So once my clay is wedged thoroughly, it's going to get kind of a tacky or putty feeling to it. And you'll notice that it stops sticking to your hands. If it's sticking to your surface or it's sticking to your hands, you need to continue wedging. Once I have my clay thoroughly wedged, I can start working with it and start building with it. So the three basic forms of clay, we call them forms, not shapes, because they are three-dimensional. The first form, I'm going to take about a golf ball size piece of clay, and I'm going to roll it between both of my hands. Both hands are going in circles at opposite intervals. And I am applying a slight pressure to it. If you're doing this correctly, you'll start noticing that you've got a wet spot that looks kind of like a donut. So if I've done this correctly, I'm going to have my first basic form, which is a sphere. It's not a circle. A circle is a flat shape. This is a three-dimensional shape, so it's a sphere. The next basic form, again, I'm going to take a hot dog size piece, and you can do more or less, but this for our immediate purposes will do. So I'm going to take this golf ball piece of I'm going to take this golf ball size piece of clay, and I'm going to squeeze it into a hot dog shape. Then I am going to go back to my butterfly position, but this time I am not going to fold my fingers. I'm going to keep it rigid. I'm going to keep my hands as firm as possible. Now, when you go to roll this clay, I am not pressing down. I am not pressing down. I am letting the pressure of my hands do the work, and rolling it also do the work. So I'm going to go from the tips of my fingertips all the way down to the bottoms of my palms. I'm going to go back and forth. And you're making a hourglass movement. So I'm going to go out, in, out, in. And if you're doing it correctly, you shouldn't hear the gadunk, 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 gadunk sound. That means it's rounding out. If it's really making that noise, you can always go in and pinch those areas that are more oval, because that's what that sound is. Your clay is an oval instead of a cylinder shape. So the second basic form is a coil. The last basic form is a slab. The last basic form is a slab. You're going to take the clay and you're going to slam it down on one side. And you do not need to really wail on this. If you do that, it's probably going to stick to the board, or it's probably going to stick to the surface. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to go like that. Just enough to flatten one side. Then I'm going to take it, I'm going to flip it over, and I'm going to do the same thing. So this is going to give you a biscuit or a thick pancake shape. Now to the actual slabbing. Slabbing is a technique where you go out and throw towards yourself. What happens is the front edge of the clay is going to hit the surface first, and gravity is going to pull it, and gravity and force are going to pull it towards you. And what's interesting about this is it will even out the thickness. So you don't have to do a measurement. You don't have to put measuring rods and trying to figure it out. All the clay will be the same, which is superior to just using a rolling pin. So I'm going to go out and I'm going to throw it towards me so that this hits first, and then that gravity keeps going. So it's kind of a slapping motion. Now, when one side starts getting too long, I can turn that, grab the longer side, and then go the other way. So once I've flattened it on both sides and I've got this biscuit shape, I'm going to go back to my butterfly and I'm going to turn that into a couple of ducks. I'm going to grab the edge of the clay so that my fingers are on top and my thumbs are on the bottom. And I'm going to slap it towards me. So you see, it's starting to pull that clay outward. And if you look at it from the side, it's relatively the same thickness the whole way across. So if one side starts getting longer than the other, grab the long side and start slabbing that side. So if you've done this correctly and you've wedged it properly, you won't have any bubbles in it. If you haven't wedged it properly, you'll start noticing bubbles. And you'll have to pop them and smooth it out. But you'll also notice that it's essentially the same thickness the whole way across. So slabs are my third basic form. So the first basic form is a sphere. Second basic form is a coil. Third basic form is a slab. Once you've mastered these, you can essentially make any clay Once you master these, you can essentially make anything out of clay. So once we've figured out the three basic forms, there's a few rules or principles that you need to know about clay. Anytime that you take two pieces of clay, you need to score and slip. Now, the word score, you probably think of sports, and that's how you make points. Scoring is making marks or a line or a scratch into something. So back in the day, when they were doing sports and somebody would score a point, they would go up to a board and they would scratch a mark in it, making it a score. So with our clay, anytime you've got two pieces that you want to put together, you need to score and slip. So I've got two spheres here. So I'm going to take a sgraffito tool. It's spelt with a G, S-G, sgraffito. So sgraffito is to scratch or to score. Some people just call it a needle tool, but the proper name is a sgraffito tool. So I'm going to scratch into the clay, and I'm going to go in all different directions. And the goal here is to make the clay look like the fuzzy side of Velcro. And I'm going to do this to both sides. So the idea is that some people try to take clay and they try to stick it to another piece of clay, and they might get it to stick. But ultimately, when that clay starts to dry out, those molecules are going to pull together. So if I've got two pieces just jammed together and they start drying out, they're going to pull apart and essentially fall, and they're going to fall apart. If I score it, I'm making little nodules and little fingers that the clay can wedge into. That the clay can work its way into. So once I have both sides scored, I'm going to take what's called slip. Slip essentially is way too wet clay. Once I'm done scoring, I need to slip it. And slip is essentially way too wet clay. So you can pinch off pieces of clay, put them in a jar, add a bunch of water, and shake it up and leave it. And eventually the clay in there and the water will break down. And if you've done it right, you'll get this pudding consistency. You'll get this pudding consistency. So I'm going to take the areas that I've already scored, and I'm going to dab the slip into those spaces. I'm not going to rub it in there. Otherwise, I'm going to close up all these scratch. I'm going to close up all the scoring that I've already made. So I'm going to take the slip and I'm going to dab it into the scored area. And I'm going to do this on both sides. Now that I've scored and slipped both sides, I'm going to take both pieces and I'm going to wiggle them into each other. So I'm kind of twisting them back and forth, and it's going to push out that extra slip, but it's going to make sure those fingers, it's going to make sure that Velcro-y area works its way into each other. Then I'm just going to wipe off the excess slip and put that back in my jar. So now these two pieces are worked together. And when they dry, those pieces, when they dry, those fingers are going to pull into one another, and it's going to turn it into one piece of clay. So whenever you're adding two pieces of clay, whenever you're putting two pieces of clay together, make sure you always score and slip, no matter what size the clay piece is. The second principle that you must know is that you need to have your clay pieces less than the other principle that you must know is that your clay pieces should not be over a ½ inch thick. What happens is the outside of the clay will begin to dry and the inside will stay moist. If it's under a ½ inch, then the whole thing will dry out. If the outside is drying and the moisture is trapped on the inside, when we go to fire it, which means bake it in a kiln, which is the big oven, when we go to fire the clay and the outside is dry but the inside still has moisture in it, that moisture will turn into a gas, and that gas will expand. So if the outside is hard and the inside is trying to expand, what happens is it explodes. So if you do not want your piece to explode, and think so to keep your piece from exploding, you need to keep it under a ½ inch thick. In the case that your piece is over a ½ inch thick in an area, so let's say this is my piece. What I can do is I can either use a loop tool, so if your piece is over a ½ inch thick in an area, so let's say this is my piece, I can either use a ribbon tool or a wire loop tool to hollow it out. A trick with this is you go down a ½ inch on your clay and you put your tool right next to it. Then I go to the bottom of my piece and I put my fingers there. That way I know when I insert this in there, it's not going to go too far and poke through the top or the sides of my clay. So taking the ribbon tool, I'm going to twist it in to where my fingers were, and then I'm going to pull that out. And that's going to give me a hole that I can work with. Then I can take my wire loop tool and I can start carving out the inside of that clay. And I can keep going around, pulling out clay until it is less than a half an inch thick. Now, if you want to close up your piece of clay, so I've got my hollowed out sphere, I can take a piece of my slab and I can score and slip this on both sides and place it over that hole. So we're going to pretend I scored and slipped this and then worked the edges in it so it looks like a solid sphere again. Then I want to take a sgraffito tool and I want to just poke a little hole into that piece. That little hole is going to allow any moisture or any little moisture to escape and keep my piece from exploding. So whenever you are making a piece, step one, make sure you score and slip any two pieces of clay that you're putting together. Step two, make sure that any piece that you're making is a half an inch thick or less. Otherwise, you need to hollow it out and poke a hole. Do more, do better.